Hello, and welcome to what is, at least so far, the most slides of any of these officers. Definitely the most slides of these of the Japanese officers so far. And it is for Osami Nagano, who is interesting. Please note that this is print screened from the joyous thing that is Wikipedia, because I couldn't find it better elsewhere, and I thought I can either do this myself, or I can print screen it. I can try and write it out myself and probably muck up the writing and muck up the accents, or I can print screen it. I can maybe get the graphics the wrong way around, or I can print screen it. So I print screened it. Anyway, he made midshipman in December 1900. Kaigan Troy, ensign, in January 1902. Kigan Shui, that's sub-lieutenant, 1903. Kigan Dale, in January 1905. Shosa, lieutenant commander, in 1910. Shusa in 1914. Daisa, 1918. Shoso to 1923. Chujo, 27. Taisho, 34. And Jensui Kaigan Taisho, or Marshal Admiral, in 43. What's interesting is he makes Marshal Admiral not long before he's actually put out to pasture, because they decide he's not doing well enough. And pretty much that's because he is not making the success that they were hoping to have. And the person behind this career is this gentleman, who doesn't really look big and scary, does he? But he is one of the scariest people you would ever meet in Japan. And this is a point he writes, and you can find it on Wikipedia. You can also find it in a couple of other books. In fact, it's the most commonly quoted point about him. In fact, some areas, it's the only thing mentioned about him. According to the opinion of the Japanese government, if Japan accepts the demand of the United States, Japan will perish. However, even if Japan fights against the United States, Japan may perish. That is, accepting the request of the United States will destroy Japan without fighting the United States. Even if we fight against the United States, if Japan cannot avoid the danger of extinction, if Japan defeats without fighting with the United States, the Japanese people will truly disappear from the earth. However, if Japanese people can fight and show the spirit of defending Japan, even if Japan fights against America, our descendants will always rebuild Japan. We hope to solve problems in diplomatic negotiations, but unfortunately, we will be fighting if we are to be commanded to wage war. Which, pretty much, is an English translation and an imperfect translation of what he says. And I would not try and butcher the Japanese by reading out the Japanese. But honestly, if you were going to translate it less accurately, perhaps in terms of verbiage, but more accurately in terms of intent, what he's basically saying is, if we don't fight the Americans and agree to their terms, we are destroyed. If we fight the Americans, we don't stand much chance, but at least there is a bit of a chance that we aren't destroyed. I've often brought up the point how many Japanese naval officers really knew what the likelihood of them winning the war was. It was a lot of them. They were not doing this because they were rabid anti-Americans, the vast majority of them. They were not doing it because they were, well, evil, war-hungry maniacs. And although I'm not saying they are nice, they order enough strategic bombings and other things in China, they are not nice. But there is a difference between being not nice and being hungering for war at all costs. These men understood the consequences of what they were doing. They understood what they were unleashing on the world. They didn't want to unleash it. But they didn't see themselves as having any other option. Nagano had previously served as Minister of the Navy. Now, I've been over the Japanese constitution before, but one of the requirements is that the ministers for the Navy and the Army must be serving generals and admirals. So, interestingly enough, the Minister of the Navy or the Minister of the Army tend to be junior to the Chief of Staff. They tend to be one of the Chief of Staff's officers. So rather than the minister outranking the Chief of Staff and being able to give the Chief of Staff orders, it's often the other way around, which does kind of have an interesting effect on civil-military relations, let's say. Because if a Prime Minister cannot get an admiral or a general to serve in his cabinet, and they're all he's at this point, then the cabinet is dissolved and they cease to exist. And if those generals and admirals do not outrank the chief, so general staff or chief of the Navy general staff, then they can issue orders, do not serve. And therefore they can bring down a cabinet, a government. And what was bringing down governments this time? Well, what to do? You see, they started off with the Hokusinron, or the Northern Expansion Doctrine. The idea that Russia was, the Soviet Union anyway, was this nice soft area to go and expand into. Doesn't it look lovely there? If I expand it out, you can even see the Kamchatka Peninsula, which a very famous repair ship is named after. You can also see the beautiful plan that the Japanese have. And then if you look at the cartoon of the Hoshinron, you can see the actual results, which were not that great. Anyone would think that the Russians turned out to be far better prepared than everyone presumed they would be. It's one of those things, though. Russia fights a terrible civil war, tears itself apart, and everyone presumes that its military is going to be weak straight afterwards. When the Americans fought a civil war, everyone didn't want to fight them for a while afterwards because they presumed the military was still going to be strong. It's one of the reasons why the Spanish-American War is delayed so much, and especially why the various actions with Mexico that happen occasionally are delayed, because they presume that it's going to take a while for those veterans to be filtered out and replaced by new recruits. So basically, Northern expansion doesn't work. So this is the first big thing which Osami Nagano comes into, because he really proposes the National Shinron He really pushes it. Yes, the prince is behind him when he's pushing it, but he really, really pushes it. And the idea is that this is the southern expansion. That they will take what is naturally theirs by going south. Because Japan can only go south or north. If it goes east, well, there's a few small little islands. Mostly there's water, and then you get to America, which is quite big and might not like you actually imposing yourself on them. You go west, well, you run into China, but the trouble is, China is not full of all that good stuff. This is going to upset people, but it's taken a lot of work on Chinese infrastructure to turn a large chunk of China into something useful for the modern world. And they're still working on that now. The Japanese weren't prepared to spend that much money, though. So, key decisions he's involved in. Deciding to go to war. That's on him. He is part of that decision-making process. He tries to propose some peace deals. He tries to propose this and that. It doesn't work. Sending the Kido Batai to Hawaii. He ums and ahs over this. In the end, Yamamoto threatens to resign if they're not sent. And so he sends them. His reason for not wanting to send them is he doesn't think he's sending enough. He thinks you need to send more. Well, the actually balance is between is there any point in dividing his fleet like this? Alternatively, and therefore potentially stopping the Americans coming charging in half-cocked, or should he send more ships and are going to make sure it drums home the effect on the Americans? This is the problem, I would say, actually, with the Kido Batai. The whole problem with it is that they do it. As they do this attack on Pearl Harbor, they either need to send more ships or more waves of aircraft and really drive home the attacks, or they needed not to do it so the Americans come charging out across the Pacific and run out of fuel pretty much by the time they reach the Philippines, at which point the Kido Battalion, the whole fleet, is waiting to embrace them in a fiery glory. All these are options, but no, they don't do it. We all know the stories about Japanese wargaming. That junior officers broke rules, did things, and it was ignored. That exercises were reset, that it was like dealing with Admiral Beatty. Every time he was losing, things got changed. Well, the thing is, in the end, it's Nagano's fault, because he's the big boss. And if that means he has to actually come down and run the wargaming himself to make sure it's done properly, then that's what he needed to do. Because if you're going to base your operations off wargaming, then you need to be doing it as accurately and as well as possible. Submarine warfare takes a long, long time to reach organization. It really does. The Japanese understand submarine warfare. They really do. They have a lot of experience in the Mediterranean, and they just haven't prepared for it. Whenever I talk about Britain, I usually start talking about Article 8 and sloops. Well, the Japanese could be making use of Article 8 as well. And if any nation should have been worried about their maritime arteries, it is Japan. Because whilst you're planning and basing everything on going on the offensive, on attacking your enemy, you can't rely on that always being the case, and submarines are the perfecto counter-strike weapon. So the fact they're not prepared is on his predecessor, but is also on him. Because if he starts ordering them in when he gets post the beginning of 1941, roughly, he could have kept ordering them, and then they would have been very useful. Or there would have been about a dozen or 2 dozen completed by the time of the heavy submarine involvement in the South China and East China Seas. And what they might have been able to do is convoy the most valuable cargoes to ensure a minimum level of supply gets through and is maintained, which could, of course, sped up and improved construction processes, which would have meant they might have had actually slightly more forces to fight their battles with, which probably wouldn't have changed things, but might have attrited the Americans even more and might have bought them a little bit longer time. And finally, there is the aircrew training pipeline. That's on every Japanese admiral, every single one, including this one. They all know there's a problem. They all know it's limiting. None of them do anything about it. Why? Because culturally that would be such a big thing to actually do. NCO pilots or anything like that, it's a big thing. They need them, but they don't want to know they need them. So what is the final verdict? Well, this is another officer who's going to fall from grace, and when he falls, there are going to be a long line of officers who come after him. But he actually does a very, very good job. It's one of the things. I can't complain about the Japanese chiefs of staff. They are doing the best they can with the hand they are dealt, and any mistakes and things that they don't do really are more factors of culture and of outlook than of anything else. And they're not the only ones who are doing this. There is the B-17 bombers dropping bombs on Hiryu during Midway. It's a case of worrying, but not as worrying as you'd think. Both sides make mistakes. Both sides take time to get going. Considering the Axis forces precipitated the war, none of them were really prepared for it. When we talked about Eric Raeder, it was said that the Hitler had promised on 1948. It's arguable the Japanese and the Italians were all thinking at the same level. But we won't know. We honestly won't. And for this gentleman, he is trying his best with the forces and the abilities he has available. Japan at no point has the forces necessary to fight America. At no point do they have the mass. But if they'd had a little bit more joined up thinking, they could have certainly done a lot better job of it. And again, that rests on the Chiefs of Staff. If anyone can bring about joined up thinking, if anyone could push for it, it needs to be him. It is on him. What else have we got coming up? We've got a lot. What have we got coming up next in this series? Well, next in this series, of course, is Admiral Karl Donitz. The star of the series in many ways. Because it's his birthday when it comes out on, so therefore, yay, for him. I hope you're enjoying. I know I spent a lot of time going through some of the Japanese ones and discussing it more, and I know this one had a lot more slides than they normally do, so I flicked through some of them quite quickly. But the point is, I'm trying to give you a bit of an introduction and trying to give an introduction to these officers. I think all of them, at some point, I'm going to have to return to and do a more in-depth discussion of, because they deserve it. But as said, you can't evaluate bonnets without having a proper baseline established. And the baseline that is fairest to establish to evaluate him by is his counterparts from the other Axis navies and his predecessor. That's the only real options to look at. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Take care.